All right, so thank you all so much for sticking around for the next three papers, which are really also, we're going to kind of just change gears. So thank you, Brian, for that great presentation. And that, if thinking about the kind of the dimensions of historical research that are concerned with kind of empiricism and objectivity, to some extent, these papers are actually thinking about the subjectivity that often is brought into the process of kind of telling our own stories to ourselves, but also in the writing of history and how historical memory is a kind of a dimension of what we as historians have to contend with. So our first presenter is going to be Clare Moran, and she's presenting a paper, and I'll read the title, a presentation based on the paper Shana and Julia OSullivan, I think I pronounced that incorrectly, Generationally Conceptualizing Collective Memories of Trauma in Fiction. And this is a paper that she developed in a class with Bruce Thompson. And I will also announce that she is also a recipient of a Dean's Award, so this paper has also been recognized at the divisional level.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So with this paper, I started with the intention to focus on women. That's a focus I like to take in a lot of my classes because I think it's often underlooked. So another thing I noticed in this class about modern Ireland was how exceptional Irish literature is. And there's just something kind of unique and special about it. So I wanted to write about a female Irish writer. And as I got into my research, I discovered Julia Boylan. And her work I thought was great, and I really loved it. As I read more and more of it, I discovered that her father, Shana Boylan, was a really famous, influential, talented writer as well. So I decided to compare them, given the time periods in which they lived, and all the upheaval, violence, and really traumatic events that happened in their times, how they influenced both authors in their own lives as well as in their work. Okay, so just to start with some historical context of Irish history in the early to mid-20th century. So like many other countries all around the world, Ireland suffered under colonialism for hundreds of years. But as the British Empire began to lose its grip in the 20th century, the freedom nationalist movement started to gain traction. In 1916, which coincidentally was 100 years ago, nationalists staged the Easter Rising, where they seized the General Post Office in Dublin and proclaimed an independent Irish Republic. The rising was crushed by the British, who executed its leaders. These executions turned the tide of Irish public opinion against the British, and this is when the independence movement got really strong as people sort of started to see just how brutal the regime could really be. Okay, in 1919, led by Eamon de Valera, that's him, the nationalist movement Sinn Féin set up a Dublin assembly. This is when the War for Independence began. It lasted until 1921, until the Anglo-Irish Treaty established the Irish Free State and partitioned the North. In 1922, a brutal civil war broke out over disagreements about the treaty itself. Hundreds of people were killed, and de Valera's provisional government forces won and remained in government. De Valera becomes the prime minister until 1948. So economic modernization efforts began in the 1950s, but large parts of the country remained impoverished and extremely socially conservative. Many young people during this time found their social climate extremely stifling. So when I was trying to figure out what differences there might be or similarities between father and daughter, Shana and Julia, I turned to some theories on generations and collective memory. So collective memory is an idea developed by European philosophers and sociologists in the early 20th century. This is the idea that individual parts of a person's memory are developed on a larger group level. And the critical years theory was developed by sociologist Karl Mannheim. This is the idea that one's most powerful generational memories are constructed in youth and made more pronounced in times of violence or war. And this is particularly relevant to Shana Boylan, who grew up in a time of extreme violence, war, and social upheaval. So he was born in 1900. He received an education infused with Republican nationalist ideals. His interest in finding and reclaiming an Irish national identity peaked when he joined the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, in the fight against de Valera's provisional government forces in the Civil War. But his autobiography is called Vive Moi, which is pretty good title, I think. He discusses his disappointment with the results of 1916 and questions whether what ensued was even a revolution at all. This point of view was common among members of his generation, especially those who were on the losing side of the Civil War. They saw the revolution as incomplete, especially because of the Northern Partition and because of the social problems and economic problems that persisted. A lot of them felt that the new Ireland wasn't so different from the old. And he especially writes about these issues in a chapter called The Troubles in My Trauma. And his use of the word trauma was really interesting. And this is where I'll take sort of a turn towards discussing some psychology here. So the sociologist Jeffrey Olick defines trauma as a psychic injury caused by emotional shock, the memory of which is repressed and remains unhealed. He elaborates with words, "We know well the dangers that can arise out of unconfronted horror and unreconciled experience, personal violence, revenge, perpetuation of hostilities, blood feuds, and sympathy for extreme political situations." So Olick here isn't writing about Ireland, but it kind of sounds like he is, specifically writing about the country given the time, Shana Boylan's time, as well as the troubles that escalated in the 1960s and continued through the 1990s and are still an issue even today. Irish history is one of trauma after trauma: colonization, war, famine, violence, terror. Shana Boylan sought to make sense of what he saw in his own time through his writing, and he succeeded. So big questions he asked were the disappointment with what he saw as a failed revolution and whether his countrymen's sacrifices were really worth it. So two stories in the book in the paper I focused on are called Midsummer Night's Madness and No Country for Old Men, because these two stories particularly illustrate the issues that Shana Boylan focused on. And just interestingly, No Country for Old Men is taken from a line from a Yeats poem, Sailing to Byzantium, which is a nod to the past. Midsummer Night's Madness tells the story of a young man fighting in the IRA during the Civil War. In the story, O'Whelan criticizes Republican soldiers and the colonial establishment they're fighting against, so he thinks it's all bad. No Country for Old Men is about older men decades later looking back on their experiences in this war. In the story, the author rejects blind nationalism that young people so often feel and act on, and which he feels is just so inherently a part of the Ireland in which he lived. So in 1932, Sean, who by this time was a major public intellectual, and his wife Eileen had a daughter named Julia. Julia Boylan came of age in the 1950s, a time when many young people in Ireland were grappling with problems of social conservatism, and to an even greater extent than their parents' generation did. Ireland remained heavily influenced by the Catholic Church, as much of the Western world was moving towards an age of increased social freedom. And Julia actually took a page from her father's book in criticizing the church. But she took a specific focus on women and how the church had harmed women in conjunction with the British colonizers of the past. So her story, This Is My Body, deals with themes of guilt, shame, sexual repression, and church misogyny. The story is part of a larger sort of women's liberation movement in Ireland that was, as Irish women and women around the world were beginning to reclaim their power. Her most famous work is called No Country for Young Men. It was written in the 1970s as violence was escalating, especially in the north, in Northern Ireland. So this title, of course, is a reference to her father's short story as well as to Yeats, as a nod to the generations that came before her. Julia Boylan offers her own take on Ireland's social climate by arguing that it is now no place for the young, not for the old. This was probably because of lack of opportunity, because of violence. Ireland was still lagging behind the rest of Europe in terms of modernization, and a lot of people in her generation longed to escape. And she, in fact, moved out of the country, moved to Paris, and now she lives in Los Angeles, actually. So in the book, Julia takes a similar approach to her father, and as she looks back on the war for independence and the Civil War through the eyes of characters who were there and who question, was it worth it, what were the results, but she updates it for her own generation. The novel questions that perhaps Ireland's traumatic past has made the country damaged beyond repair, but at the same time, throughout the book, characters express hope for a better future. And to close, from a quote from the poet who influenced both of my authors here, Hope and Memory have one daughter, and her name is Art. So through their production of Art, Sean and Julia Boylan showed that you can confront a nation's trauma for yourself and collectively, and and through processing these traumatic events, perhaps lessen the trauma itself. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Claire. So next up we have Tyler Lewis, who is presenting a piece of his paper entitled Wolf from the GDR to the City of Angels. And this is a paper that he developed under the direction of Matthew Lazar.
I think there was one. Yeah, okay. Hi. I'm one of the alum. Claire's the other one. Yeah, so my name's Tyler. I'm going to be talking today about Krista Wolf. She is one of the most famous authors from East Germany. I would say, in my mind, she's probably only overshadowed by Bertolt Brecht, the East German playwright. But maybe in a different room that might be more contentious. Krista Wolf, man, she's a really interesting author. She's very charismatic and very controversial. And I think what amazed me, as I did more and more research about her life and her writing and her relationship as an individual to her state and to her countrymen and women and West Germans. Yeah, she was mired in controversy and people loved her. And people hated her. She was awarded and lambasted. So before I get into Krista Wolf's background to better understand her story, I wanted to begin with an anecdote. So in 1992, Krista Wolf accepts an invite from the Getty Center in Los Angeles. They want her to write and do research. She takes this opportunity to write a book where she's looking for her friend Elle. That's all she's named. But so it's her quest in Los Angeles. It's like a brand new country. She's only been in the United States once before. She's coming from the GDR, where most people haven't been able to travel. I mean, like, if you can go to Hungary, it's like a miracle. So, I mean, this is the world that she's coming from. So she goes to the passport control through customs. She hands her East German passport to the passport controller, and he says, "Are you sure that this country still exists?" She says, "Yes, I'm very sure. I'm very certain." So that was her foray into America. Yeah, so I guess let's get started. So, yeah, why study Krista Wolf? Krista Wolf, I mean, I've said it before, she was born in East Germany, but I think one really interesting thing about Krista Wolf is how in such a repressive society, in a society that's so limited with freedoms, it's interesting to see through her career how Krista Wolf kind of challenges the state and other people's expectations of literature, especially within the communist world, and how she tries to remain an authentic individual and a writer with a sense of individual purpose and who can lend their experiences to their writing and not just write about what the state wants them to write about. So in doing this essay, we read a book. You also read this book. We read a book in Lazar's seminar on Europe and the world during the Cold War. It was called PostWar by Tony Judt. And in Tony Jutt's book, so he looks at the Cold War after World War II, and he has several central theses in his book about how he explains the reconstruction of Europe in a divided Europe post-1945 and its reconstruction. So two of Jutt's theses are one, that historical memory is initially repressed or was initially repressed after World War II so that societies and individuals could reconstruct themselves and their identities, but that this memory was revisited later and reconciled with. So this was Wolf's Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is her coming to grips with the past. And then the second one was about the decline of master narratives. So Tony Judt argues that after the Cold War ended, the kind of idea of master narratives between capitalism versus communism they were coming to a close, and that, looking at a history from a perspective of dialectical materialism, like a Marxist-Leninist like Wolf would, became to fall out of fashion. But if you look at Wolf's writing, so there's an injunction point or an inflection point in the early 60s where Wolf attends a conference, and basically the state wants her to follow this party line, come up with a character that's from the proletariat that loves his nation, that's not searching for money or doing things for career ambitions. So she comes out and she says, I want to, at this conference, she comes out and says, I want to write from my authentic experience. She wanted to use her experiences as a woman to better portray her characters and come up with more realistic characters. And it ended up being pretty controversial. And she was a candidate for the Socialist Unity Party on the Central Committee, and that nomination was redacted, and her husband, Gerhard Wolf, was also stripped of his privileges. Even despite this, Krista Wolf was a very privileged member of East German society. So she would have access to like inner shops, which are duty-free stores. She had more freedom to travel. She probably could have gotten a car if you wanted a Trabi. She had more freedoms. And this is something that in her writing she reconciles herself with and comes back to and grapples with. So I guess we can take a couple steps back. I'm going to come back here. Oh, is that it? Okay. I thought I included more than that. Okay, so I guess to take a step back and so we can understand Wolf better. Really Wolf, in terms of the German experienced more than almost any other person could. Really she experienced, 4 eras of German history? She was born on March 18th, 1929 in Landsberg an der Warthe, which was formerly in Prussia. So, sorry, I'm nervous. So she was born in Prussia at the end of the Weimar Republic. She grows up and comes of age in Nazi Germany under the direction of Hitler, Goering, Goebbels. When she's 16 years old, she flees the Red Army, who are invading what is now Poland, and she settles in Bad Frankenhausen, which is in Thüringen, in central Germany. She ends up studying literature at the universities of Jena and Leipzig. She meets her husband. She becomes a writer for Neue Deutsche Literatur, New German Literature, and Neues Leben, which is New Life. She gets assigned to move to Halle, which is an industrial town near Leipzig. She becomes a rail car factory worker, and she uses this experience to write about her character Rita in her most well-known novel, Divided Heaven. So Divided Heaven, the 30-second explanation is essentially it's set in 1961 in Berlin. It begins in East Germany. So Rita is the main character. She's in her early 20s. She's kind of disaffected with life. She's working in a railcar factory. She is dating this guy, Manfred. Manfred moves to West Berlin to work for a chemical company. Manfred decides that he wants to work there and live there, and Rita's unsure about it. So she goes to visit him in West Berlin, and she is thinking about buying a return ticket. Am I coming home to East Germany? And she looks at her tickets, and she says 2 ways of life for 40 Pfennig. That's something that makes Berlin different. but it was her experience having worked in this railcar factory, having dealt with a society that was completely divided. In a certain way, she does make herself like Rita, the main character. Her experiences are based on Wolf's experiences. So she worked in a railcar factory. She was unsure at times about her ideological position. She didn't know if she wanted to work in the East or the West. She was a child of the post-war. But anyways, she ends up coming back to East Germany, disaffected with West Berlin. Some people said that this was kind of trite and that it was a socialist trope, but Krista Wolf's reasoning was like her own, is that she felt that Rita wanted to make a better world in spite of the difficulties. And when we look at Krista Wolf's life, we know that she had several opportunities to escape East Germany. She could have left before 1961. She could have crossed what it became the Berlin Wall. She was invited to talk in Sweden in the 70s. She was invited to talk at Oberlin College, where she worked there as a writer. And she had the opportunity, again, to go to West Germany. So she could have left. She came back. I'm sorry, this is a lot. Anyways, if you look at Krista Wolf's writing, she deals with kind of memory and the repression of that. She deals with living in a classless society, even though she is a privileged member of that society. Krista Wolf's writing challenges the state, but not entirely enough that she's let off the hook. Some people in East Germany criticized her for not fitting in and not accepting the party line. And some people in West Germany criticized her for not criticizing the East Germans enough. Krista Wolf actually at one point worked for the Stasi as an informant. That was something I would like to touch on more if I had more time. She didn't admit this until the 1990s, but this was part of the repression of her memory that she used as an instrument to kind of help rebuild her life and escape from the throes of dictatorship. I wish I had more time. Basically, Krista Wolf, I think, is a misunderstood author. And I think despite having to live in a communist country with sort of, so much repression, I think she did a good job in expressing herself in an authentic way and expressing herself and her perspective as a woman and challenging in what she said in the book Cassandra was a patriarchal literary tradition that began with Homer and spanned over 2,800 years. Did she ever fully reconcile herself with the fact that her country disappeared twice? 3 times? Not really. And did she ever come to terms with the fact that communism was really over? She didn't. And did she really ever come to terms with the fact that she was an informant for the Stasi? She didn't. But with that said, I think, considering the obstacles that she had to overcome, I think she had a pretty remarkable career, and I think that the awards she won were very deserved. And I know there's still definitely a lot of research to do on her. There's a lot more of her literature that I would like to read more thoroughly. I never got a chance to go through all of her diaries and her letters. The history is so tangible, you can almost trip over it. But yeah, there's a lot more work to be done. And thanks for listening.
All right, thank you, Tyler. All right, so for our last paper, we're going to head backwards in time. So we're going to have someone representing this earlier age. And that paper is going to be presented by Grant Shryock, and the title of the paper is St. Louis, Imagining a Saint King, and this is a paper he developed with Cindy Poacredi.
Hello, everyone. I guess as the last of us to speak, I should say thank you for sticking around. And also thanks to Brian for speaking, for everybody else who's spoken. I know a compliment from me is only worth so much, but it was, yeah, everything was really good, super good. So that being said, I'm going to be talking about some research I've done on the 13th century Saint King Louis IX of France, who is pictured here. The title of the paper, Imagining a Saint King, other than proving that the influence of Benedict Anderson can appear in unlikely places, is a rough attempt to sort of concisely phrase what I thought was really the driving question behind the paper, which was, how was Louis' sainthood sort of understood or conceptualized by his contemporaries, and how did they negotiate the seemingly mutually exclusive categories of saint and earthly king? Because it's important to remember that the sort of the religious landscape of 13th century France had been deeply affected by the rise of the mendicant orders, whose sort of like apostolic model of piety, emphasizing poverty and preaching and the rejection of ostentation, could be at times uncomfortably at odds with the sort of aristocratic culture of the feudal elite. So, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, a king hadn't been canonized in the West for quite some time before Louis. But in any case, I began the project intending to trace the sort of discursive developments around the praising of kings by comparing Louis to some of his predecessors. But I won't get into that too much because it's not what I want to focus on. But much of the research that went into that aspect of the paper sort of grounds it in necessary historical context. So it might be useful to mention it a bit. So essentially, the century or so before Louis' accession to the throne in 1226 was largely favorable to the Capetians. The Capetians being the royal house that he was a part of. So allowing for, the occasional reversal, the trajectory of Capetian foreign and domestic policy was towards increased administrative centralization and territorial expansion. So, for example, in the early 12th century, one of his ancestors, Louis VI, struggled to subdue the Castellan families in and around the Paris region, as well as, bring royal influence further afield to the lords who only nominally acknowledged Capetian authority. And then decades later, Philip Augustus, Philip II, sort of famously annexed Normandy, Anjou, and parts of Poitou, among other territories, which significantly increased Capetian resources, revenue, and then also showed Capetian France to be one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Latin West. So much so that the reputation, by Louis' time, the reputation of the French kings was such that this Louis IX, was approached by Mongol generals who were seeking to form some kind of an alliance against Muslim power in the Levant and Egypt. So to return to Louis and sort of the question that I raised earlier about how his sainthood was understood or expressed or imagined by his contemporaries, there's really no way around Jean de Joinville's Life of Saint Louis, which, that's just a picture of a manuscript copy, but it's really the classic hagiographic work tied to his cult, and yet it's really anything but a sort of conventional example of what proper hagiography is. Its treatment of Louis sort of alternates between lauding him as a saint versus praising him as sort of an earthly, worldly king. And sometimes even these two poles are sort of confusingly mingled, which to me, I guess this inconsistency reveals the failure of Louis' aristocratic peers to understand him in terms beyond or outside of their sort of limited feudal aristocratic social context. And so since, what follows is really just a critique of this primary text, I'll say a few words about its author and its composition. So Jean de Joinville was a noble from Champagne who came to Louis' court as a young man in 1241. He accompanied him on crusade between 1248 and 1254, and really just served him in several capacities on and off for much of his life until Louis's death in 1270. So he knew him quite well. The life was commissioned by Joan of Navarre, who was the wife of Louis's grandson, and it was completed in 1309, about 39 years after Louis's death. The text is divided into two distinct sections, I guess. One titled Louis's Sanctity in Deed, and the other Louis's Sanctity in Word. And so Louis's Sanctity in Deed, which I'll discuss first, it's, I guess, the more unconventional of the two as far as proper hagiography is concerned, because of its preoccupation with presenting Louis as sort of a worldly king operating in this sort of social context defined by aristocratic and feudal sensibilities. And so this idea is predicated on another idea that sees the text having been composed in two distinct phases, meaning that the section Louis' Sanctity in Deed was composed first, much earlier, probably right after Joinville returned to France from Crusade, and importantly, without an explicit intent to make Louis a saint. So on the surface, I guess one of the most striking problems with it is that Louis is not even the main focus of the section. Joinville spends much more time telling his own story, so that the section reads more like the chronicle of a military campaign than a proper saint's life. Louis is, I guess, and even when he does address Louis, the image he creates is one of, a feudal lord, devoutly religious, yes, but without the sort of saintly patina that you would expect to find in a proper saint's life. So Louis is at times either depicted in fanciful silks at court, drinking with his knights and feasting with his retainers, or he's dressed in full military garb, talking with his counselors or negotiating with Egyptian generals over resources, prisoner exchanges, and so on. All of which are, of course, very, very important images for us, but they're sort of a far cry from the saintly image of Louis that his cult will develop for him in later years. And so while the crusading narrative, as it's sometimes called, deals primarily with the worldly Louis's Sanctity in Word, the other section, which Joinville wrote in the early 1300s after he was approached by Joan of Navarre, was composed, I would say, explicitly with a mind to make Louis a saint. So it mimics traditional hagiographic forms in ways that the crusading narrative does not. For example, it emphasizes his holy speech and his good death, as they say, and a few miracles associated with the cult. However, Joinville also praises many qualities that are intimately connected to Louis's function as king. And so the issue, as I see it, is that though the intent in this section is to correct the mistakes made in the crusading narrative by separating the saint from the worldly man, Joinville unintentionally anchors Louis to the realm of politics and kingship. So to be quick, I'll provide one example of this. Joinville makes a big to-do in this section about Louis's sort of divine passion for law and justice. This is sort of best represented by this kind of now famous image of Louis sitting with his counselors beneath an oak tree in Vincennes, sort of freely dispensing justice to his subjects. And that is an image of it. And so as Joinville describes it, people could put a case to Louis's counselors, and if they were unsatisfied with the ruling, they could appeal over their heads to Louis himself. And so Joinville, I guess with this passage, he intends to somehow bind Louis's love of justice with some sort of notion of sanctity, as if divine justice was being channeled through him somehow. And yet, to my mind, the image it creates is just one of royal law practiced in real time. So Louis's hands-on approach to law and justice was in fact intimately linked to his political career because of a personal conviction that he had that law and justice were both a duty and a right of the king. And so he took it quite seriously, particularly after he returned from Crusade. His legislative agenda becomes particularly ambitious. To address royal abuses and malpractice, he issues the Great Ordinance of 1254, which, among many other things, establishes the foundations of this appellate court system that survives in France all the way until the Revolution. And so, essentially, as I promised to be quick, an analysis of the life of Saint Louis is really a study in genre. So, taken against a wider tradition of hagiography, the life is in many ways a dynamic text that shouldn't be limited to a single literary category, because to do so, I guess it masks the inconsistencies of form and intent, which give us an idea of how Louis' contemporaries understood him as a man, as a feudal lord, and as a king, as well as how it sheds, I guess, a revealing light on the deliberate and sometimes clunky process whereby a king, in this case Louis, is transformed from a king, an earthly man, into a saint. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, Grant, and thanks to all three of you for such interesting and diverse papers. And so just before we turn it over to the questions from you all, I'll remind you again that Stephanie Sawyer will be coming around with a microphone, so if you can wait to give your question until she gets to you, that'd be great. But I was just thinking of the connection between these two panels. So Chris Cruikshank mentioned the idea that time only moves forward, right? But part of what history is telling us and is reminding us that as humans, we are constantly stuck in this weird time warp in which we can't really shed both a sense of the past and also the way the past intrudes into the present in sometimes really painful ways. The category of trauma that was introduced in one of the papers suggests. And so I think that this illustrates, these two panels together really illustrate the strengths of history as a mode of inquiry. At the risk of repeating myself, we have the first panel is really dedicated to the process of discovery and the ways in which we can identify additional evidence and tell new stories. But I think the second panel really underscores the way in which we have to make our own engagement with the past part of our object of inquiry, that we come to the past with sets of categories, with sets of assumptions that invite our own investigations as well. And so I really want to thank all six of you for such great papers that I think illustrate so much about what the strengths of our students really are. And the final thing I'll just mention before you go to the questions is that one thing that I was thinking about is, as my fellow professors here will acknowledge, we sometimes get twitchy when people refer to works of history as novels. Every book is simply a novel. We go, no, it's not. It's nonfiction, right? There's a difference between fiction and nonfiction. But I think this again underscores the idea that that distinction is an important one, but not an uncomplicated one. And that kind of subtlety in appreciating the kinds of evidence we encounter is really valuable, and I think is something that we bring to the table outside of the context of the university. So with that, if we can have questions for these three papers, that would be great. Over in the far corner there.
For Tyler and for Clare, I wonder if you could comment on the extent to which your female writers were influenced by the feminist movement of the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, okay, I'll start. There's not that much information about Julia O'Fwillan out there. She's not that well known, especially not in America. I can guess that she was probably influenced by the feminist movement because her work definitely has almost radical feminist images in it. But there's not like an interview where she says, yes, I'm a feminist, and yes, like I was influenced by the women's liberation movement. So I don't know, I guess is the short answer.
Yeah, I would say, in a word, yes. I would say, yes, Krista Wolf was influenced by the women's liberation movement. I don't think it was as, in some ways, I think it was more and less explicit. I mean, in the East, women's rights were much more advanced and much more opportunity to work and advance, and men still didn't do their chores. But did Krista Wolf come out and say, like, I'm a feminist because of the recent events that have been happening? I don't think she would have said it like that, but she definitely identified herself as a female author in a patriarchal literary society, especially in East Germany too. I mean, there was Monika Moran and Helga Königsdorf. Those are the only two female East German authors I could think of. So, I mean, it's definitely something that she embodied and was proud to be a woman. But influenced in a different sense, I think.
Thanks a lot for all of these papers. They were really interesting. I have a question for Clare. So it sounds like a lot of what you're looking at is related to historical memory. And my sense of moments of really intense conflict or trauma, that historical narratives are often driven by a separation between perpetrators and victims of that moment. And I'm wondering if between looking at the mother and the father, if those narratives of who the perpetrators are and who the victims are, if those carry over between the two of them, or if they change over time, or are they...
Between Sean and Julia?
Yeah.
So I think that the simple way of looking at this is the British are the perpetrators of the violence, which they were. But both authors complicate that story, and especially in talking about the Civil War, about all the brutality that happened between the Irish people themselves. And history is always not just black and white, and it's not like there's a good guy and there's a bad guy. And yeah, definitely these two authors talk about that a lot.
Thanks.
This question is for Grant. Do you think that our sources about who we consider holy people to have become too uncomplicated in the present era? Are you trying to kind of re-enliven the complexity of contemporary hagiographic works in any way? What are your kind of general thoughts and trends about the significance of a complicated saintly life?
I was told these questions would be easy, but I mean, as far as contemporary saints' lives, I do not know much about them. I haven't read anything that's come out in the last even like 300 years. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing. What I was trying to do with this is that it's just trying to kind of re-engage with the text and show it to be something that, I guess, given that it's been kind of pigeonholed in a single genre, it's doing much more than it would seem, I guess. Because if you sort of take it as a saint's life and it's only operating in that way, then you kind of miss an opportunity to understand the other things that it's telling us about history and about the specific person that the thing is about. So, I mean, as far as modern sort of saints' lives, I couldn't really tell you, but yeah.
Other questions?
Clare, so in your research, did you find that the kind of repression of historical memory based on traumatic experience was more of a societal issue or an individual issue? And if so, just, what kind of aspects of Irish society did you see kind of being more repressed so than others?
I think that memory can be formed collectively, but trauma is processed individually more. But I can't, speak for anyone because it's such a personal experience. As to what part of Irish society was like the most traumatized, I don't know. That's a really tough question. I think that as with any other, like Ireland's not unique in that it was colonized, and so any country that suffered under that kind of oppression, like India, for example, history carries over into the everyday, into the present, and I think that there's probably very few areas of life where, like, traumatic events from the past don't matter. So maybe all areas for some, maybe for some, nothing. They don't think about it. Probably just it depends, I guess. Yeah.
All right, one more question in the back there.
I have a specific event-based question that I'd like to ask you. So, for the Irish experience, especially during the Troubles, the hunger strikes of the early 80s are probably one of the most important and traumatic events because they focus so heavily on the body. So I'm just wondering what you would think, Julia Whelan would think, with respect to the celebration of hunger strikers, male hunger strikers in the H blocks, but at the same time a suppression of female hunger strikers in the Armagh jails, and what might account for that discrepancy?
I think she would really dislike all of that. I think that both Julia and Shana Boylan rejected that kind of intense nationalism. And yeah, I think that, I don't think she would agree. I mean, it's not really for me to say what she would think, but having read her work, I think that the sort of aggressiveness of the hunger strikes, I think she would find to not be the right way to go about things. But at the same, it's complicated because at the same time, I don't think she would agree with, Margaret Thatcher's policies either. And as far as the suppression of women, I think she would be definitely against that. Because I think we can look at her as a feminist writer and someone who saw men and women as equal.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think at the cue of the dog, I believe that we have arrived at the end of our event this afternoon. But in the last moments, I hope you would join me in thanking first. I'm going to come to our panelists, but also the history staff who make this possible. So Stephanie Sawyer and there's Kayla. I was looking for. Kayla Ayers have really done a tremendous job and a lot of work in making this happen. So thank you all for all your efforts throughout the year, but especially this moment. And so also, if you just join me in one more round of applause for all of our panelists. Thanks for such terrific papers.